Okay, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem at all. Don't worry at all. So the first goal of the talk is a brief introduction to the area that I'm working in, at least most of the time, namely so-called physical unclonable functions, or PUFs for short. Hopefully I will succeed in transporting at least some of the fascination that many of us share for the area. The second goal is actually, as Ben already mentioned, to introduce my own research, my own activities at UConn and also elsewhere. And funny enough, to some extent, you could even see it as an inaugural talk at UConn, having been appointed 2 years ago in pre-pandemic times. Sigh, many people might say here. So I think it's the first public talk that I'm giving at UConn. Good, and this agenda sort of transforms into the following outline. I'll start by giving you a brief introduction to the physical phenomenon that underlies the entire area of PUFs, namely physical disorder. This will be the topic of the first section. The second section will deal with the Internet of Things as one of the main upcoming and adventing challenges to everyone in security research. The third section will then merge these two strands and talks about how physical disorder can be applied in the Internet of Things to achieve certain interesting security properties. And then the fourth section is more or less devoted to giving the kind of overview that Ben already mentioned. I'll give a couple of research spotlights, I think 6 research spotlights overall, that describe the area that I'm working in and the research that I have done over the last years and that I'm also intending to do in the upcoming years in a bit more detail. I've entitled that PUFs 2.0 and machine learning, because these are the two main strands in my own research: new PUF primitives and machine learning. And then, as usual, I conclude by a summary in section 5. I think roughly we'll talk about 50 minutes. The talk will be about 50 minutes roughly. Good, so then let's start with this phenomenon that underlies my research area. This phenomenon is called physical disorder. If you would take a microscope and if you would examine all the objects that are present in the rooms where you are currently located, the chairs, the tables, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the windows, etc., then you would find that the small-scale structure of all these everyday objects is not perfectly smooth, but to the contrary, it's random, imperfect, unique, or in one term, physically disordered. And two particularly striking examples I've put on the slide here: paper, which is an everyday medium that we're used to since our childhood days, really, nevertheless has this very rich and faceted structure, with paper fibers being three-dimensionally interwoven with each other. And the same applies to many plants, actually. Crimson clover, as example on the right-hand side, has a perhaps yet richer irregularity and randomness in the Z dimension. And something similar can be said about many man-made objects, also about many electronic objects. CDs are an example for the same phenomenon. Even two CDs that store exactly the same digital information content on a sub-digital level have that unique and slightly, at least, disordered and random appearance. So they have a unique analog fingerprint, if you would like to call it that way, even if they store exactly the same digital data. And the same applies to essentially all computer chips. On the right-hand side, you can see a cross-section through Apple's A5 chip. And you can see that, of course, the geometrical shapes that you see here are not perfect, right? So there are some small deviations. I hope that you can see my mouse pointer. There are some small deviations and irregularities. And of course, if Apple and the chip manufacturer have done a good job, then these small deviations should not affect the digital functionality of the chip. At least normally they should not. But still they are there, and they distinguish every chip, even from the same series, from every other chip from the same series through this unique randomness. Now, you might ask, why is that interesting at all from a security perspective? What are the security relevant features of physical disorder? And the first and most obvious feature, I think, is that such physically disordered systems are very hard to duplicate or to clone, even for their original manufacturer. So even the original manufacturer of that paper surface would have a very hard time and would find it practically infeasible and impossible to refabricate exactly the same structure. So even the manufacturer, even if you gave the manufacturer $1 billion or $1 trillion or whatever amount, he or she could not fabricate exactly the same specimen or instance of that paper surface twice, simply because the technology for manufacturing doesn't exist yet in 3 dimensions. Maybe in 100 years, maybe in 200 years, maybe in a remote Star Trek universe in 500 years, but right now we just don't have it. It's just not possible on planet Earth in the year 2021. And another interesting aspect is that usually physical disorder is considered an unwanted phenomenon or a nuisance. So if you would talk to nanophysicists next door at UConn who are trying to fabricate their nanoscale structures in a perfect geometric and smooth fashion, or if you would talk to circuit designers at Intel who are trying to downscale their technologies, they would tell you that they fight the occurrence of physical disorder every single day of their working life. So they don't particularly like this phenomenon. It's really an unwanted phenomenon. And the question that I'm posing in my research, and that many colleagues all around the world are posing as well, is can we exploit this omnipresent phenomenon constructively too? Can we use it for something? And this talk is more or less about how we can exploit this phenomenon in a security context. That gets me to the second section of my talk, which is about the Internet of Things. Of course, I can't deal with all possible questions or all possible aspects of the IoT. This would rather be a book with many pages, but I'll just, glimpse at a few important aspects that are relevant for my own research. Now, if you would like to describe the Internet of Things with one word, then this word would probably simply be massive. It's one of the most massive endeavors that mankind has ever undertaken, with predictions saying that by 2025, we will have 42 billion connected things in the IoT, an incredible amount. And these 42 billion connected things will generate 80 zettabytes of data every year. 80 zettabytes of data. I had to look that up because I didn't know what a zettabyte was. It seems that a zettabyte is 10 to the 21 bytes, so 8 times 10 to the 22 bytes of data collected every year. And of course, this allows previously unseen services. No need to talk about this. This is beyond any doubt. There's this brave new world out there created by the IoT. But at the same time, from a security perspective, it also causes unprecedented security issues. Challenges that we have never seen up to now in the security community, not just quantitatively, but also qualitatively. And there are, of course, many issues here, but I think the core technical issue, at least from my perspective, can probably be subsumed by saying, how can we achieve security with highly connected, mobile, lightweight, cost efficient and resource constrained devices. So how can we get security with highly connected, mobile, lightweight, inexpensive and resource constrained devices? And I think it's this particular mixture of attributes that generates, on the one hand, a super complicated attack landscape, but at the same time does not leave too much leeway for protective measures. So the fact that we're talking about devices that are highly connected, mobile, creates that super complicated attack landscape, but the fact that they are lightweight, inexpensive, and resource constrained doesn't leave us too much leeway to react to this threat. And I guess the core question is, how can we achieve security in such a setting? And I think it seems fair to say that classical design recipes at least reach their limits in this context. And let me expand on that thought a little bit more on the next slide. In which sense do classical security design recipes reach their limits? Well, let's clarify first of all what I mean by a classical security design recipe. So the way we constructed our security hardware in the past more or less was like this. So we had a piece of security hardware. Then we assumed that there was a secret key in non-volatile memory stored permanently in digital form in that hardware. And whenever needed, the hardware would sort of access that key, would transfer it to the crypto module or the crypto algorithm, and the crypto algorithm would then do some interesting stuff for us. And we also would assume that there was a trusted, blue-eyed manufacturer wearing a tie and a suit, being trustworthy for everyone and having no own interest at all. And this trustworthy manufacturer would fabricate that system for us because we don't have semiconductor foundries in our garden, so somebody else would have to do that for us necessarily. Now, as I said, I think it's fair to say that these classical design recipes, at least to some extent, are reaching their limits generally, but especially and even more so in the Internet of Things and in its special threat landscape. And let me give you a number of reasons for that claim. The first reason is that non-volatile memory is not in every hardware, especially not in the inexpensive and lightweight systems in the Internet of Things. So we might have systems where there is no NVM. And this already poses a challenge to our classic design recipes, right? Because how would you individualize the system without NVM on board then? A second threat or a second challenge is that security mechanisms and algorithms, of course, cost space and energy, and both are very scarce and rare resources in the Internet of Things. So space and energy are not to be spent for free in the IoT. So how can we how can we overcome this issue as well? How can we make our systems most efficient? How can we save cost and energy in our security applications? And in these classical architectures, that's not so easy because we need a number of standard ingredients, key storage, crypto algorithm, etc. A third major issue when classical design recipes meet the IoT and its special threat landscape is that keys can be extracted in various ways. So the last 20 years of research since Paul Kocher's ingenious attacks in the 1990s showed us that clever adversaries have many possibilities for actually extracting the keys, not just from the places where they are stored permanently, but also from the crypto algorithms and their operation, or perhaps even while they are in transit from the storage to the crypto algorithm. And a fourth and last issue is that these trusted manufacturers that I've been speculating about just a couple of minutes ago, these saint-like figures that have no interests on their own, are a bit of a myth. They don't really exist in reality. And in reality, we most of the time might have a bit of a mixture of a manufacturer wearing a suit and a tie and shady glasses at the same time. So people might actually have interests that go in diverse directions. Let's put it this way. Now, let me illustrate what I've been saying a little bit more, perhaps by one example that should be known to everyone, the so-called war on secret keys, if I may call it like that. So what I mean by the term war is this decade-long and notorious fight between secret key extractors and secret key protectors in hardware. And I think it's fair to compare this fight at least a little bit to a cat and mouse game that has been going on for a really long time with no clear winner yet. In the 1990s, people took, Paul Kocher in particular, came up with a number of really sophisticated and smart attacks. His timing attacks quoted thousands and thousands of times, as you know. And then just a little bit later, his differential power analysis quoted even yet more often. And then the community reacted to this, playing these cat and mouse roles. The community reacted to this and came up with perhaps smarter implementations that were trying to overcome these attacks. Also, the crypto community, so I've put a typical crypto paper here on the slide. The crypto community got involved in it, and people started to investigate how private circuits could be constructed that are secure against probing, etc., etc. This published at Crypto, at a typical hardcore theory crypto conference, or at least crypto conference. And then again, of course, part of that cat and mouse game, the attackers were hitting back. And I think the two latest pieces that attackers came up with are Meltdown and Spectre. Both made it to the headlines of the New York Times and of many, many other news. New York Times here speculating that all of the world's computers could be insecure. Of course, that might be a bit of an exaggeration. But I think it's fair to say that Spectre and Meltdown and similar micro-architectural attacks will keep us busy for a really long while right now. And what I'm trying to do in my research and what all these other colleagues working in POFs and related topics are trying to do in their research is we're really trying to end this war. And we're asking ourselves, can we alter the situation fundamentally? So can we alter this cat and mouse game fundamentally by throwing in a new security resource, namely physical disorder? So instead of this war, instead of this cat and mouse game and this ongoing battle with new publications here and there in either direction, can we replace this by throwing in a new resource, namely physical disorder, as you have seen it over the last slides? This is the question that I'm posing in my research. And this takes us to the third section of the talk, physical disorder meeting IoT security. And I will talk a little bit about concrete ways of exploiting physical disorder in order to improve IoT security and protocol security in typical IoT contexts. And the first primitive that I would like to discuss, and actually the only primitive in the brevity that this talk necessarily must have, are so-called strong physical unclonable functions, or strong POFs. Strong POFs, in the first place, are nothing else than such a disordered and unclonable physical system. Examples of such disordered and unclonable physical systems we've seen over the last slides, right? Paper surface, integrated circuits, CDs, etc., etc. Strong POF is nothing else than such a disordered and unclonable physical system that can be challenged from the outside by external stimuli or challenges. And when such a challenge or stimulus is applied to the POF, it reacts by producing a corresponding response Ri. Each response is a function of the applied challenge and of the specific disorder in the system. So let me say that again, because that's so important. Each response that the strong POF produces is a function of two things. First of all, of the applied challenge and of the specific and individual disorder in this particular POF instance. And these challenge response pairs, CIRI, are often abbreviated by the term CRP. This is an acronym that you should try to remember because it will occur very frequently throughout the talk. CRP means challenge response pair. Now, there's a whole slew of different paths which all meet the properties that I've just described: disordered, unclonable, challenge response paradigm, etc. Strong paths, on top of these general properties that every path must fulfill, have a number of additional specific features. And these specific features are the following. First of all, strong paths should have very many possible challenges, ideally, but not necessarily exponentially many in some system parameters. Many possible challenges, so many that you cannot expect to read out all of them in practice. So imagine that your path would have 2 to the power of 128 challenges. This is roughly 10 to the power of 38. Then you could not expect to read them out even in the age of the universe. So even you can do the math yourself, back of the envelope calculation. Even if you could read out 10 to the 6 CRPs per second or even 10 to the 9 CRPs per second, the age of the universe would not suffice in order to read out all of these challenge response pairs. So that's the first requirement, very many possible challenges. Second requirement, strong paths should have a highly complex challenge response relation, so complex that no machine learning or other numeric prediction of unknown responses is possible for the adversary, even if many other CRPs are known. So if the adversary knows a small subset of this entire huge CRP space, he should be unable to extrapolate from that small subset to the entire space. That's the idea. And a third requirement that is quite interesting, I think, from a security perspective, is that strong paths should have a publicly accessible CRP interface, meaning that everyone holding possession of the path or of the path embedding hardware could apply challenges and read out the corresponding responses. So there is no isolation assumption here, which is interesting, I think, from a security perspective. Usually in security, we are used to assuming that a certain part of the system is isolated and also has to be isolated. For example, the part that stores the secret key. Here there is no such isolation. So there's really something new going on. Publicly accessible CRP interface, no isolation. Now, with that description in mind, you might be eager to learn about examples. How can strong paths look like? And this is what I put on the next slide. And let me start with the historically first strong path that was introduced at MIT in 2001 and 2002 in the group of Neil Gershenfeld at the Center for Bits and Atoms. I think physically speaking, it's really a very simple but still very beautiful construction. The idea is as follows. So the path itself is a small plastic platelet, very thin plastic platelet. You can imagine that it might have dimensions of 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 2.5 millimeters. And in this small plastic platelet, we have a number of small light scattering elements, for example, small glass spheres that have been distributed randomly inside the puff. And when you now shine a laser beam from outside onto the puff, the laser light is scattered multiple times inside that structure and generates an interference pattern. Sometimes people also call it a speckle pattern of bright and dark spots that can be conveniently recorded by a CCD camera. And this interference pattern depends, first of all, on the point of incidence and angle of incidence of the laser beam, which is variable, right? So you can shift the laser beam and move it and also change its angle of incidence on the path. That's the first thing that the interference pattern depends upon. And the second thing that depends upon is this unique and random configuration of these light scattering glass spheres inside the puff. And this configuration, of course, is fixed after fabrication. So it's random during fabrication, but then once the plastic becomes hard and the scatterers become immobile, this configuration is fixed. It's random initially, but then it's fixed. While this laser beam is actually can be varied and is flexible. And of course, all that I've been saying already points in the direction of how we can exploit this structure as a path. So the challenge, as I already hinted at, is regarded the point and angle of incidence of the laser beam, the path challenge, with in the end around 10 to the 10 distinguishable challenges that lead to different and decorrelated responses. The response of the path is usually considered as this interference pattern or speckle pattern, which has thousands or perhaps even millions of bits, depending on the CCD camera by which you record it. And the disorder and randomness that causes the unclonability of the path are these positions of the glass spheres. And I think it's really a beautiful construction that never has been broken. So this has survived the test of time. It's been introduced 20 years ago, has not been broken, has neither been cloned physically, nor have people been able to numerically predict its outputs, its responses. So both attack vectors here have not worked, at least up to now. But there's one issue in terms of practicality, unfortunately, because this setup requires high precision measurement and positioning of the laser beam. So whenever you wanted to measure the same path challenge twice, possibly at different points of the world, so when you use it on a credit card, for example, as we will see later on, then you would have to measure exactly the same challenge response pair in different ATMs all around the world. And this is very hard because you would then need to position the path in exactly the same distance to your CCD camera, and you would have to position the laser beam at exactly the same point and angle of incidence. So this is really absolutely non-trivial and highly complicated, which is the reason why this otherwise beautiful and highly secure construction never made it to practical applications, or at least not on large scales. And for this reason, people came up with a second construction, an integrated circuit that was meant to fulfill the properties of a strong path as well. And this integrated circuit is called the arbiter path. It's been introduced also at MIT, also around 2002 by the group of Srinivadas, so a different group at MIT working coincidentally on the same topics, which is interesting. I think it's a nice historic coincidence that these two groups, which I think did not know of each other, at least that's what Srinivadas told me once, they did not know of each other, but they came up with very similar concepts on the optical side and on the integrated circuit side around the same time, with this arbiter path that I have on the slide right now being introduced by Srinivadas. Now, how does it work? The arbiter path is a structure that consists of so-called stages. A stage is whatever you can see inside this dotted rectangle here. So this structure that I have on the slide has 128 stages. And we assume that there is an electrical signal entering that sequence of stages, and that signal is split into two signals, a red signal and a green signal. And then these two signals conduct a race against each other through that sequence of stages, right? So they race from left to right through that sequence of stages. And the paths which they take on their race are determined by external bits that are applied at each of the stages. If one of the external bits equals a 0, then the two signals just race on in parallel. They do not exchange positions, but the top signal stays in the top position and the bottom signal stays in the lower position. But if the external bit is a 1, then the two signals exchange their positions. The top signal moves down and the bottom signal moves up. And since you can choose all of these external bits at these 128 stages independently of each other, you have 2 to the power of 128 different ways of configuring this race, right? 2 to the power of 128 different ways of configuring this race, which the two signals conduct against each other. And at the end of the structure, there is an arbiter element. This is also where the name comes from. There's an arbiter element that calls the winner of the race. And depending on who the winner is, whether the top signal here arrives first or the bottom signal arrives first, this arbiter element outputs either a 0 or a 1. So depending on which signal arrives first, this output Y here will be a 0 or 1. Good. Now let's see how this translates to our path formalism. Well, I think it's not too difficult, right? The challenge Ci in that case is that sequence of bits that is applied at the structure from the outside. The response is just a single bit, namely this output that indicates which signal won the race. And the disorder and manufacturing variations, the disorder and randomness that is required from a path are simply the manufacturing variations that occur whenever you fabricate that structure in silicon. And these manufacturing variations cause some runtime delays for these signals, which is also the reason why one of these signals arrives first and another signal arrives second. Because as you can see, this layout is perfectly symmetric and it's meant to be perfectly symmetric. And if there were no manufacturing variations and no runtime delays for the signals, then both signals would arrive at exactly the same point in time. But whenever you cast that structure in silicon, then of course these manufacturing variations will occur, and that has the impact that there will be a winner in the race in the end. Good. Any questions up to this point on the concept of a strong path or on these two implementations that I've shown? By the way, feel always free to interrupt me. I'm happy to turn this from a monologue into a dialogue and to take any questions at any time. So always free.
just to make sure, you kind of expect the only thing you would need to characterize this thing is the difference in delay at each stage, right? It's like a single parameter at each level, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like at least the internal parameter space here is much smaller than that optical system.
Absolutely. And this is also the reason why this structure has been attacked by machine learning attacks. I'll come to that point in just a second. Absolutely. So the arbiter POF has its advantages on the practical side. It's smaller and can be integrated into microelectronic systems far more easily, but it has some insufficiencies, let's put it this way, on the security side. It's by far and wide not as secure as the optical POF. Absolutely. Good. Any other questions or comments or suggestions? If not, then let's proceed. But as I said, you can always interrupt me at any point in time, no problem at all. Now, what's the most straightforward application of these strong paths? What can they be used for? What are they made for? The archetypical application of a strong path is an identification setting or authentication setting that is usually paraphrased in a bank card context. So we assume that there are two parties, a central authority, for example, some bank headquarters on the one hand, and a piece of hardware, for example, a bank card on the other hand. And that piece of hardware carries a strong path. So there is an individual and unique strong path that has been attached to the bank card. And now we assume in this archetypical identification protocol that both of these entities go together through a secure setup phase. And in this setup phase, the central authority chooses a number of challenges at random and applies these challenges to the path, collects the responses, and writes these challenge response pairs down in a secret list. So stores them somewhere in a safe place on a server that other people can't access, for example. And one thing that is very important here, this CRP list, of course, is just a tiny fraction of this entire CRP space of the POF. So the POF has this huge CRP space, at least if it's a strong POF, it has this huge CRP space, as already mentioned, this inexhaustible CRP space with an exponential amount of CRPs. This list that is put down in the setup phase, of course, is a tiny fraction only, a tiny subset of this huge CRP space. It basically acts as a fingerprint. It's not the entire CRP space, but just a small fraction of it, a fingerprint of the POF by which we can later identify the POF. And at some point, the secure setup phase will end, it will close, and then we assume that the hardware is given to a customer, Alice, and Alice carries around the hardware, the bank card in this case, in her pocket or in her wallet for a while. And then at some point, she might want to withdraw money from her account. And then a very simple protocol is being executed between the bank headquarters and the bank card. And in this protocol, the central authority, the bank headquarters in our case, chooses a number of challenges at random from that CRP list and sends these challenges over to the hardware, the bank card. And the bank card applies these challenges to the strong path, gets some responses in return, and sends these responses back to the bank headquarters. And then these responses are compared to the responses in the CRP list. And if they match, then the bank headquarters will authorize the money transfer. If they do not match within some previously specified error threshold, then the money transfer will not be authorized. Super simple protocol. We assume super simple protocol. What are the advantages? So why did this protocol cause such an incredible hype in the community? And I think it's fair to say that it did cause an incredible hype in the security community. But why is that? Because it's a dead simple protocol to some extent, right? And the reason for this hype are a number of clearly defined advantages which this simple toy protocol has. The first and foremost advantage is that there are no digital secret keys required in the hardware, for example, on the bank card. So I'm always using this symbol in order to indicate this. There are no classical, in quotation marks, meaning digital and permanently stored keys in non-volatile memory necessary in order to run this protocol. at least not on the side of the bank card. So the so-called prover in the identification protocol becomes key-free. There are no digital keys here. And I think this overcomes a paradigm that has been active for decades, or arguably, depending on how you see it, perhaps even for centuries, where you would assume that a secret is necessary in the prover's hardware in order to identify yourself over digital communication lines. This is not the case here. So POFs overcome that decade-old or perhaps even century-old paradigm in the area of cryptography, which is kind of nice. Then a second advantage, which I always found interesting from a theory perspective, because I'm a mathematician originally by education, is that this protocol avoids the standard computational assumptions that you would usually make in cryptography and security. For example, the hardness of the discrete logarithm problem or of the factoring problem play no role for this particular protocol. They are irrelevant. So you could even consider this protocol as a post-quantum secure protocol. Quantum computers will not affect its security in any way. Then there's a third clear advantage. If optical POFs are used, and I hope you remember 3 or 4 slides ago, we introduced these optical POFs. If they are used, then we even do not need electronics in the hardware, on the bank card, for example, in order to identify ourselves. And last advantage, even malicious manufacturers cannot clone the strong POF. We've been talking about this manufacturer resistance also a few slides ago. Even malicious manufacturers cannot clone the POF. So you have at least some level of security against malicious manufacturers. And in essence, and in sum, this means that the security that we have here against external adversaries like Evil Eve, or against malicious manufacturer like this little guy here on the right-hand side, that this security against external adversaries or against malicious manufacturers is quite strongly improved. So their possibilities, their attack vectors sort of fade out. They don't have the usual strength, or sometimes they might even disappear completely and might be actually confined to not attacking the system at all. Good, that's the idea. Now there's another protocol that I'd like to discuss with you just briefly, key exchange via strong POFs. We have 2 parties, as is standard in key exchange, Alice and Bob, and an external adversary, Eve. And we assume that both are connected via an authenticated binary channel and a completely insecure physical channel over which tokens or POFs can be sent. And we assume that in order to reach that goal of secure key exchange, Alice at the very beginning of the protocol is given a strong POF. And now let's see what she can do with that strong POF. Well, she can proceed as follows. She can choose a number of random challenges, C1 up to CK, apply these challenges to the POF, obtaining responses, and then she can derive a key from these responses by some publicly known procedure, for example, I don't know, fuzzy extraction or any other suitable kind of mechanism. And then Alice physically transfers the POF over this insecure physical channel over to Bob. The transit might actually take a while. It's really a token-based physical protocol in that sense, that you require delivery of that strong POF from Alice to Bob. And we assume that in this time frame, Evil Eve, of course, can access the POF. But she has a problem in this situation, right? Because first of all, she cannot clone the POF. Secondly, she cannot derive a numerical model for predicting future responses of the POF. That was the second property in that list of strong POF features that we defined a few slides ago. She also does not know the challenges that have been used by Alice at the beginning of the protocol and cannot directly apply these to the POF. So she's quite limited in her capacities. And all that she can do during her time of access is more or less choose random challenges, apply them, and get the responses. But since the challenge response space is so large of the strong POF, the probability that Eve just by chance will apply exactly the same challenges that Alice has been using in the initial phase is incredibly small. It's exponentially small and actually negligible in practice. Now, at some point, the strong POF will arrive at Bob's place, and then Bob will notify Alice that he has received something over this authenticated digital channel, and only then Alice will share these challenges that she has been using in the first part of the protocol. Only now Alice will share these and send them over to Bob. Of course, Eve will now learn them. So by eavesdropping, she will learn these challenges, but that's too late because she no longer has physical access to the strong POF. And now Bob can do the same thing that Alice did initially. He applies the same challenges, gets the same responses, and derives the same key K. And now Alice and Bob have shared this key, while Eve is unable to derive the key. And I like this protocol so much. I think it's really a toy protocol. I'm not so sure how strong the practical relevance of this protocol really is, but I like it so much because it illustrates why all these features that we have asked from strong paths earlier on are in fact necessary, right? So that large CRP space is necessary, because otherwise, if the CRP space was small, Eve could read out all CRPs in the course of the protocol. The unclonability is necessary, that numeric unpredictability is necessary. Also, the publicly accessible CRP interface is necessary, right? So this protocol assumes that Alice and Bob alike, for the functionality of the protocol, can apply challenges and read out responses. So really all the protocols are necessary. And even though no one has ever proven that formally, I think it's probably fair to say that these properties that are stipulated earlier on are equivalent to this protocol being secure. Would be nice to conduct such a proof at some point. So maybe some theorists at UConn would find it interesting to join in there and to join forces. I would find that very interesting. And key exchange is actually not the only protocol that you can build on strong paths. There's a whole variety of other protocols and clever schemes that allow you to realize oblivious transfer. And once you've done oblivious transfer, you can, of course, do bit commitment and secure multi-party computation as well. So strong paths are not just a hardware security tool, but really a universal cryptographic primitive, very strong and universal cryptographic primitive. And I think it's fair to say that this thread was perhaps started in 2010 with the result that oblivious transfer was possible based on paths. And then the crypto community jumped onto that trend. And crypto, Eurocrypt, crypto publications, also publications in the Journal of Cryptology quite recently in 2010, dealt with that thought and extended it yet further. And I think that's nice because people usually see POFs as a security primitive, as a hardware security primitive, but they are not. They are not just a hardware security primitive, but they're also a universal cryptographic primitive. Good. So that gets me. Oh no, sorry. There's one more thing. But in order to unfold all that potential that strong POFs have from a cryptographic perspective, there's also a certain price you need to pay. There's a certain price tag associated with this possibility of implementing all these protocols, namely the strong paths that you use in the protocols have to be designed very carefully. And this sort of points or alludes to the question that Ben posed a while ago. If you use too simple strong path architectures, then so-called machine learning attacks or modeling attacks on paths loom. And the idea of a modeling attack is that the attacker, Evil Eve, instead of physically cloning the path, simply tries to derive a numerical model or trained machine learning algorithm from the input-output behavior of the path that can predict the path's responses just as well. So it's essentially as effective as a physical clone in terms of protocol security. It's in terms of attacks, it can do essentially everything that a physical clone can do as well. But it's far cheaper. You can do it on a desktop computer in your home instead of requiring an entire semiconductor fab in order to run the attack. So this is the most effective and most efficient and inexpensive attack form that has been developed on strong paths up to this date. And here's a small table from one of my earlier papers that illustrates you how effective these attacks actually are. So in the left-hand column, we've listed the machine learning method, logistic regression in that case. Then the next column shows the CRP source, FPGA or ASIC. And then the middle column shows the prediction rate that we achieved. And here you can see that we can predict the challenge response pair space, this entire challenge response pair space, with 99% accuracy by learning by collecting just 6,500 CRPs as the training set. So as I already mentioned, the CRP space overall is 2 to the power of 128, which is around 10 to the power of 38. But a few thousand CRPs and collecting just a few thousand CRPs suffices to train a model within less than a second on a desktop computer, standard desktop computer that every one of us has as in their homes, in order to predict the entire path with more than 99% accuracy. And this was really a devastating result for the community. Here you can see a little bit actually how graphically how this attack works. So we have plotted the CRP consumption that you require for a certain prediction error. And you can see that you can even go below a prediction error of 1% if you invest enough CRPs.
So Ulrich, intuitively, the reason why the ML attack works is because there is too much variability in the physical properties of the thing that causes the delay. What's the intuition for why the ML attack works?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks so much for that question. So the intuition is that this internal mechanism basically that maps the disorder or these runtime delays into the output, that mechanism is too simple. Because when you put yourself in the perspective of the electrical signal, right? So when you traverse the structure from left to right, all that you do basically is you collect these delays. So you could think of just adding up these delays. Exactly, it's just additive. So when you go through the stages from left to right, it's all additive, it's all linear, and that's too simple. So it's easygoing or a piece of cake, you could say, for the machine learning algorithms. So we need something that is more complicated, something that is non-linear. The problem with non-linearities, though, is that they might also introduce instabilities, right? So, for example, let's again take this architecture as an example. The runtime delays, of course, vary with temperature. So if you imagine, when you imagine an architecture that has a very strong dependency of the output of the response on the exact runtime delay, for example, a nonlinear or even an exponential dependency, then the output would not be very stable, right? Because the tiniest and smallest difference might already cause a great difference in the response signal as well. And this is the $1 million question. I don't know if people still say $1 million question. Probably it's the $1 billion question in these days. So the $1 billion question in these days is how can we combine stability with high complexity, with high internal complexity. And to some extent, that question is still unanswered. Not completely unanswered because many people are working on it, but it's not fully resolved yet. Is that a satisfying answer? But thanks for the question.
Absolutely.
Great question. Thanks so much.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. This looks from a theoretical machine learning perspective like the problem of learning a weighted threshold function.
Yes.
And I'm curious on the theoretical front, what's known about that theoretical version of the problem? Of course, I understand that for something like this in practice, you might be able to, in practice, you might be able to do more, but I'm just curious about what's known on the theoretical end.
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. Great question as well. So there's not been too much work in the POF community about that theoretical problem, at least not so much work that I know about. There are two different threads by two different groups on the theoretical part of the problem. One of them is in this paper that I'm quoting down here from ACM CCS 2010. We've been considering the Wapnick-Chervonenkis dimension of the problem a little bit, and then we've been speculating about the exact relation between the machine learning complexity and the challenge length, and we derived a theoretical formula for that was empirically validated at the time. So there was some, sort of superficial connection that we established. And then the group of Jean-Pierre Seifert from TU Berlin, also really one of the leading groups in hardware security in these days worldwide, I think, they investigated the complexity in the PAC learning framework, in Leslie Valiant's PAC learning framework, probably approximately correct learning framework. And I think they were really showing and proving that it can be machine learned in a certain time complexity. If you want, Alexander, I can try to find these papers and send them to you later on if you want.
Oh, no, that's fine. And since I've already interrupted you, I also had one question about the key exchange setup. Mm-hmm. In that slide, it looked like you were focusing on a passive adversary, but it seems like it should be maybe sort of straightforward to enlarge this to handle an active adversary that might even replace the puff on the fly just by making a couple of check queries or something.
Exactly, absolutely. I think that's what you would do.
That's neat. Okay, that's neat. Thanks.
Exactly. Yeah. You're welcome. I just wanted to keep it simple, and that's why I made this assumption and also put it there in the title: authenticated binary channel and passive Eve. But you're quite right. In practice, you would have an active Eve, then you would have to introduce some checks to make sure that the path has not been exchanged completely and also has not been modified, by the way. That's also important, right? Because Eve might opt not to exchange it, but just to modify it. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's very nice that can be handled essentially using exactly the same infrastructure and techniques. Very pretty.
Exactly. That's what I thought as well. That's kind of cool. And of course, there are some similarities here also to quantum key exchange, right? I guess you might have noticed that the BB84 protocol has some similarities with that scheme as well. Good. Okay. Then any other questions? I'm really enjoying the discussion, so always feel free to interrupt me at any point in time, really.
Sorry, I missed this, what you said earlier. So the attack was successful because the construction is not good. If the construction of the strong path is really strong, then would the machine learning attack be successful or impossible?
The hope is that the machine learning attack would then become too hard to be carried out in practice. So by definition, basically a good strong path, if you would like to call it that way, a strong path would resist any machine learning attempts.
Okay, so basically the problem is not the strong path itself. It's actually, this is not actually a strong path construction. So that's
exactly
the issue.
Exactly. So I'm not saying that all strong paths are useless or that this concept doesn't make sense. This is not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that this very first implementation from 2002 was not good enough. Basically, historically it has a lot of value. So I don't want to criticize Srini Devada's group, but from a machine learning perspective, it's not complex enough to resist modeling attacks. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thanks.
Good point. Thank you very much. Yeah, great. Now, there are more complex strong paths where no attacks are known, and I think I've hinted at that already. The optical path that we've dealt with a couple of minutes ago is exactly an example for such a strong path that has resisted all modeling attacks up to this point. And since this primitive is already 20 years old, so this particular implementation here is already 20 years old, that's quite a long time in cryptography, right? Many cryptographic primitives get either broken or at least attacked in parts in such long time frames. But here we don't even have the scent of an attack at the moment. There is no attack to this particular optical path construction. This also means, of course, that machine learning expertise is necessary in order to construct strong path implementations in practice, because machine learning tells us, or machine learning expertise and in-depth knowledge in machine learning tells us where the borderline is between learnable and therefore insecure strong paths and non-learnable and therefore secure strong paths. And for this reason, machine learning really plays a pivotal role for my own research, and I think for everyone working in strong path implementations and partially also strong path protocols. Good, that more or less concludes that section. And now let me continue with a couple of research spotlights. I entitled that section Paths 2.0 in machine learning, because this is more or less the area that I'm working in, that intersection between new path primitives and new path strategies on the one hand, and machine learning on the other hand. And again, please feel free to interrupt me. I'm really enjoying the discussion. It should be more of a dialogue than a monologue. So just make yourself heard and interrupt me at any time. So the first design goal that we have, many people have in these days in the entire community, and that I also have personally in my own research, is to construct new secure silicon strong paths that have very high machine learning resilience. These new architectures could either be digital, this would be great because that's perhaps the most effective way of implementing them. But if secure digital implementations turn out to be hard, then secure analog implementations would be just as great as well. And here's one example of what we have been doing in recent years. This is an architecture that Martin van Dijk in his group and myself came up with, and that we published in 2019 at CHES. So as you can see here, we have one basic building block of that architecture. This is a so-called XXOR arbiter path, where you use several of these arbiter paths that we have seen on the last slides in parallel. You use them in parallel, apply the same challenge to all of them, and then XOR their responses. So you basically have a large XOR gate that puts together all their responses. And we have two of these blocks, and then we play a nice, neat little trick. We use one of the responses of this earlier XOR arbiter path block as one of the new challenge bits to the challenge that is applied to the second XOR arbiter path block. And the hope here is that the adversary, of course, finds it hard to predict what this first block here does. And as long as the adversary was unable to predict what the first block did, he or she does not even know the challenge that has been applied to this second block, and therefore cannot run any machine learning attacks on this second block. At least that was the hope when we came up with that strategy. It has turned out in the meantime that smart and sophisticated machine learning attacks can at least attack this structure up to a certain level of complexity, not for all possible challenge length and for all possible choices of the parameters x and y, but for very substantial complexities, unfortunately. So that's one strand, new digital architectures. And as you can see by this sketch here, this is all looking a little bit like cipher design, doesn't it? And in fact, it is a bit like cipher design. So there are strong similarities between cipher design or hash function design on the one hand, and the construction of secure digital strong paths on the other hand. Now, a totally different strategy that we are also following is to use analog circuits that are two-dimensional. The arbiter path is really just one-dimensional, isn't it? And also directional. There are always these signals going from left to right, but the signals are not going back in the other directions. And also equilibrium states between different parts of the system do not play a big role. This is different here, right? So the idea is that you have a two-dimensional array, basically, of cells where the neighboring cells are talking to each other and where signals permeate through the entire structure due to the fact that the neighboring cells are talking to each other. And we hope that this, in the long term, will give us yet stronger complexities. But we were really just about to start here. We haven't been digging into that space all too strong yet. But I think the future of strong path design could actually look like this: two-dimensional arrays of cells that are talking to each other and where signals permeate over long distances from the left lower corner to the upper right corner, etc. Machine learning again plays a pivotal role here. I already mentioned this, and just to give you a sense of the weaponry that both sides are applying here, and also that the machine learning side is applying here. This is a citation from the acknowledgements of this 10th paper here in the list. So we say, or we said at the time, that we thank the high performance computing centers of FU Berlin and TU Berlin for 59 years of CPU time, because this is what we spent on developing the attacks and also computing the attacks that we were reporting about in this 10th paper here. So especially the attackers are using incredibly strong resources in these days, which is a good sign to some extent for the area of paths, because we have really brought the attackers to the edge of what is still possible. So by a relatively small structure like this interposed path, we have forced the attackers to investigate decades of CPU time to break these structures. And I think if we can really push things just a little bit more, just slightly more, then we might have pushed the attackers over the edge and pushed them into a regime where the attacks just are not feasible anymore. So that's kind of good. It's kind of good news. But I just wanted to mention this aside. It's 59 years of CPU time. Now, these are the colleagues with whom I'm working on that: Martin van Dijk, of course, Wayne Burleson, many others, Jean-Pierre from TU Berlin, and a large fraction of these are working on machine learning attacks. So as you can see, machine learning here really is pivotal, and it's basically almost half of the colleagues here working on these machine learning attacks that go hand in hand with a good design. Now, what we can also do, and I think that's kind of interesting, we can sort of sacrifice practicality, at least to some extent. So if we are willing to sacrifice practicality of these strong path constructions to some extent, then we can develop architectures that are provably secure against machine learning. And we have nicknamed these architectures chic paths. Of course, that's supposed to be pronounced like the French word chic, because we sort of like these architectures so much, we found them very chic. But the acronym chic, SHIC, stands for super high information content. And the idea here is, and I'll just touch upon it because I don't have time to go into the details, but happy to discuss this later on if you want me to. So the idea is that you generate a system that has maximal entropy, maximal disorder, and then you read out this disorder very slowly by a crossbar-like structure. And this crossbar-like structure consists of a set of parallel wires on the top of the structure and then an orthogonal set of wires at the bottom of the structure. And inside here, this is shown as transparent, but in fact, inside here in a sandwich-like construction is this super disordered substrate that I'm showing here on the left-hand side. So a set of parallel wires, then this super disordered substrate in the middle, and then another set of parallel wires. So a challenge response pair then in this structure is you activate one of these top wires, you activate one of the bottom wires, And by doing so, you measure the structure that is sort of in between these sets of wires. So at this crossing point between the top wire and the bottom wire. And by doing so, and I'm really taking a shortcut here because there are a million details involved actually, but by doing so, you can realize a POF with the following core features: huge entropy with up to 10 to the 10 CRPs per square centimeter, which are all information theoretically independent. So since these wires or these cross points relate to different spatial segments of this structure, they are all information theoretically independent. And we also make this readout intentionally slow, like 100 CRPs per second, so really a small readout speed. And this gives you in the end then the only known strong POF with provable security against machine learning. And let me illustrate this a bit more. Why is this provable secure against machine learning? Well, as I already mentioned, all CRPs are information theoretically independent. So this extrapolation step that you usually have in machine learning, where you go from a knowledge of a small and tiny subset of the entire CRP space through extrapolation and machine learning to knowledge of the entire CRP space, this extrapolation step does not work because the CRPs that you know are information theoretically independent. They are not related in any way or correlated in any way to the other CRPs. So there's nothing to extrapolate. You just can't extrapolate. That's the secret behind it. But there are some practicality downsides. I've said at the beginning, if you are willing to pay a practicality price, you can achieve this provable security against ML. And the practicality downside here is the area consumption is relatively large. It's a few square centimeters, which by modern standards for an integrated circuit is quite large. On the other hand, you can still fit it on a bank card, right? The bank card is even larger than that. So it might be possible to use this on bank cards. And the readout speed is relatively slow, between 100 and 1000 CRPs per second. But what you gain is this provable security against ML. And we are exploring this idea also with a couple of colleagues from UConn, Helena Silva, Martin van Dijk, if I count him as half UConn, half CWI, Wayne Burson is involved, Chang Fei, Xia from Amherst, and two former students of Helena, Nafisa Noor and Sadid Munir. Right. The next flashlight or spotlight, as I said, trying to organize this in sort of a spotlight way in order to illustrate some of my research topics. You can also use POFs as novel security sensors. Some POFs have temperature-sensitive responses, which usually is considered a downside or a bad aspect. But you can also turn that into an advantage and can use them as secure temperature sensors. So you exploit the fact that the responses are temperature dependent in order to construct new types of sensors. And people that I'm working with on that idea are Uno Mutlu and Lois Rosa, and again, Wayne Burson, as you can see, he appears quite frequently in that list of collaborators. And you can even use that in order to remotely spy on temperature in any IoT devices without dedicated sensors. So as an attacker, if you can connect to a device that has SRAM or DRAM inside, and if you can access these SRAM and DRAM and start writing into them and reading from them, you can use that in order to infer the temperature of these cells. So you can remotely spy on temperature, even in devices that do not have dedicated sensors on board. I always thought this was an interesting idea. And here's some graphics that shows that it works. I'm not going to go through all the details, but I think the lesson to be learned from that graphic is we did experiments with a certain POF variant called bistable ring POF. And the experiments showed that without optimizing its design, you can use that bistable ring POF as a sensor that has a temperature resolution of 4 degrees Celsius. So this works relatively well. Then you can also use entire rooms as strong POFs. That's also interesting. So assume that you wanted to protect the Mona Lisa or any other valuable painting. Then you could use the gallery where this is exhibited as a POF. The entire room could be used as a POF. Because as I said already initially and at the beginning of the talk, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the windows, etc. of any room are unique and unclonable and disordered as well. So you can use the entire room as a POF if you want to. And well, we've been thinking about this thought and elaborating on it. You need a radio wave source then inside the room, of course, and then the radio waves are scattered multiple times. You need a detector inside the room. You also need a way of generating this exponential amount of challenges. But this is relatively easy. In that case, you just take an array of k independently switchable radio wave scattering mirrors that you can switch between 2 positions each for each mirror, then again you have 2 to the power of k different possibilities of exciting or stimulating that room. And you can also do that for nuclear weapons control and arms control, which is interesting, I think, a very interesting application. And we've been investigating this with a number of colleagues in Germany, but also here in the US, Alexander Glaser from Princeton. And here you can see that we got featured in the university magazine in Bochum with exactly that topic. Now, another interesting area, so it's the second to last example application or flashlight or spotlight that I wanted to present in this section, are optical puff capsules. So instead of integrating a puff on chip, you can also try to protect a chip against invasive access from the outside by a so-called capsule, a puff capsule. And here you can see a sketch and a cross section through a standard architecture. The idea is that you have this optical puff surrounding a certain valuable system. And now if somebody drills into that structure and through that structure, the optical scattering behavior would change drastically, and the challenge response behavior would notably be altered by such a step. And then you can use this in order to detect that something fishy has been going on. And in particular, you can sort of derive a key, system internal key, system specific key, by which you encrypt the hard drive or something like this. Now, on the right-hand side, we can see a standard approach to achieving exactly the same feature or exactly the same property. It's an IBM 4767 that many of you might have seen already. It's certified on level 4 by the NIST, which is the highest achievable level in commercial devices. And the idea is really that you have a mesh, a temper sensing mesh around the valuable circuit, and this temper sensing mesh reacts to being drilled into, and then it very quickly as possible, erases all the sensitive data that is stored inside the system. Of course, this has to be battery powered, because this sensing of the mesh needs battery, and also the erasure and the reaction of the system to invasion or to invaders needs battery power. So this must be powered all the time. Whereas this system does not need to be powered. It's smaller, lightweight, it doesn't require any battery. So the hope is that we can use systems like this in the future as very small, inexpensive, but nevertheless highly secure security anchors and communication nodes in the Internet of Things. And it's also material science research, at least in parts, because you can add a number of other new features to this puff capsule if you want to. For example, you can try to realize a property that we call electrical reconfigurability, where you apply a certain electric pulse to that structure, and then it completely changes for good its internal configuration. So you make a new puff out of the old puff, basically. This is what we call electrical reconfigurability. And you can use that for secure data erasure. So you can encrypt your hard disk drive with a key that is derived from this puff capsule. And now when you electrically reconfigure that puff capsule, all your hard disk drive becomes unreadable. That's the idea. And we've been following up on that idea by a couple of colleagues from Caltech at the time, Ruhrmair and Chuang-Wai Yang, and published that at Toast 2015. Still think it's kind of an interesting idea that connects material science research with security research. And right now we're working on these and similar ideas with, again, a number of colleagues, Ruhrmair, who now moved to Duke University from Caltech, Huisao from Yale, Ben, of course, who's also present in the audience, and a number of other colleagues. And again, machine learning plays a pivotal role in all of this. Good, and last application, which moves away from puffs at least a little bit, I'd like to call this founding cryptography on DRAMs. Founding cryptography on DRAMs. So you can see already in the title, there's a certain tension between the theory here and the hardware part, actually. And of course, it alludes to the famous paper by Joe Killian on founding cryptography on oblivious transfer from Stock 1988. And what we found is that you can also found oblivious transfer on DRAMs, establishing a nice link between theoretical crypto and hardware security. And this is a DRAM cell. It's perhaps the simplest type of memory you can imagine. One part or one element stores the information. The other part actually regulates access to that information. And as you all know, or at least those doing electrical engineering, these DRAM cells have to be refreshed periodically, because they are volatile and lose their memory content without being refreshed. And then you have a regular refresh operation every few 10 milliseconds in the system. But when you disable that refresh operation, the capacitor in the DRAM cell starts to discharge. And depending on the exact system architecture and also depending on the manufacturing variations, some of these cells discharge fast and others discharge very slowly. So there are super slow cells that discharge only over a week or so. So typical retention time is 7 days for these super slow cells. And you can use them in cryptographic protocols, because when this decay curve here, so when you are on this decay curve in the cell and then you read the system at a certain point, it's either set up to the full voltage VDD or it's set to a 0 voltage. So there's some information loss, some inherent information loss in that readout procedure. Either you fully reset to full charge or you fully discharge. And this inherent information loss upon readout is, of course, reminiscent of quantum key exchange protocols in PB84. And this is what we found as well. So we saw that similarity, and that led us to designing key exchange protocols based on that effect, and even oblivious transfer protocols based on that effect. And again, this is joint work with a colleague here from UConn, Walter Krawitz, who had to leave a few minutes ago, and also a couple of other folks at Yale, and Stefan Katzenbeiß at Passau, and Stefan Wolf and one of his PhD students at Lugano. Good. So that concludes this short research spotlight. It's not been that short. I think I've been talking too much. I apologize for this. But now we're almost done. Let's wrap up what has been said. So I hope that I could convince you in that talk that physical disorder, this phenomenon of physical disorder, is not just a nuisance, as Intel engineers might see it, or as nanophysicists might see it. It's not just a nuisance, but it's much more. It's actually an omnipresent and also extremely powerful security resource. And one of the main security primitives that exploits this phenomenon of physical disorder, so-called physical unclonable functions, or PUFs, can help us overcoming certain limits of classical security hardware, especially in an IoT context. So if this is a standard system, then we can use PUFs to make it key-free. And the fact that it's key-free sort of fades out the typical attack vectors that both external adversaries and malicious manufacturers would have. So it fades out these attack vectors, or perhaps makes them disappear completely, which is kind of nice. And in this sense, PUFs can do a bit more than you can do in classical, purely digital architectures. By digging deeper on the physical level, you can do a bit more than you usually could. I focus on strong PUFs and their impact in this talk almost solely, while there is actually a much larger space to explore, but I didn't do that because otherwise the talk would have been even longer than that. But let me just give you a couple of example primitives: weak PUFs, complex PUFs, simple systems, unique objects, funny sounding names. Happy to discuss them later on via email if you want to. And there are also some other goals that are yet more demanding than just making systems key-free. We can also try to achieve something that I call secret-free security or trust-free security. If you want to, then you can check out this paper that has been published in 2020, just recently in November, at the Ashes workshop, if you want to learn more about secret-free security. And again, let me stress this pivotal and decisive role of machine learning, both for attacks and for creating sustainable and long-term secure designs. Now, last slide. There's one thought that I wanted to share that I always found quite interesting and fascinating, especially when I prepared this talk. I think it's fair to say that the IoT is about the convergence, or a convergence at least, of the physical and the digital world, right? So both converge, devices are getting yet more pervasive, yet smaller. So the IoT is about a convergence of the physical and digital world. And its manifold security challenges arise exactly from this fact. So it's a brave new world out there application-wise, but also a very challenging world out there security-wise, exactly because of this convergence. And now the cool thought that I kind of liked is that the disease in this case is also the cure, because this convergence to physics also provides us with a very rich toolbox for re-establishing digital security. Helpful, for example, in this context are the phenomena of physical disorder and unclonability, of nanotechnology, special materials can be used, etc. So physics is not just the disease, but also the cure in that sense. And having shared that thought, let me thank you for your patience. I think I'm way over time. I apologize for this. But this is it. Thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much. I have one question, but I want to give the chance for other people too.
I think somebody's asked about the room, right? Why would you use an entire room? Should I start with that question, Ben? Is that a good question to start with, maybe? So the reason why we're using a room here is because we want to protect this room against thieves, for example, against intruders or invaders. And we want to detect if something in this room has been removed or taken out of the room, or if somebody has entered the room without having permission. And if we want to realize this via POV techniques, then I think it's a good idea to use the entire room as a POV. Does that make sense? Is that a satisfying answer? Great.
Okay, let me ask one, which is, you kind of talked about two different attacks, which is trying to physically clone this thing and then building a machine learning model. Has anybody actually tried to use physical access to gain information they shouldn't in order to aid them in developing a machine learning model?
Yes, that's a very good question, Ben. Thanks so much for the question. So Ben is basically saying, is there a hybrid attack form where people are using physical side channels, you could say, right, in connection with machine learning? And yeah, so people have been trying that around 2014. Wayne Burson was involved in that. I was also involved in this. And we actually did find out that very simple side channels could boost machine learning performance from exponential to polynomial. So there was a huge difference. For example, when you look at these XOR arbiter paths, right? So you have K parallel arbiter paths and you XOR their responses in order to produce one final response bit, then just knowing how many of these inputs to the XOR gate have been a 1 and how many of them have been a 0 without knowing which specific inputs were 0 and 1, but just knowing the cumulative number of zeros and ones can already boost machine learning performance from exponential to polynomial. And we had a chess paper in 2014 about this. Wayne Burson is on the paper and a couple of machine learning colleagues from Munich and myself as well. And we were quite surprised about this, super surprised. And the most advanced attack form in this hybrid attack model is also a very simple one, actually, where you take into account the CRP stability. So you would measure each challenge response pair, not just once, but let's say K times, and then you would look at how often the response flipped. There might be super stable CRPs, right, where you get the same response K times, and there might be others that are 50-50, etc. And also this information helps you to boost your machine learning performance from exponential to polynomial when you attack these K, XOR arbiter paths. Again, a very surprising result in 2015 by Georg Becker, also published at Chess. But good point. So I think these hybrid attacks more or less are, they are really the most efficient attack forms. But interestingly, we're not using physics here to clone things, but we're just using physics in order to gain yet more information from the system besides the standard CRPs.
Okay, I think probably we're 20 minutes over, so we should let people go. But thanks very much. This was great. I appreciate everybody's sticking around and doing the slightly different time. But let's say thanks very much, Uli. This was awesome.
Yeah, thanks to you guys. And if there's anything to discuss, just drop me an email. I'd be happy to continue the discussion at any point. And sorry for being over time again.
No problem.
Thank you so much. It was really a great talk.